good afternoon, as it is for most of our participants. And you're very welcome, a warm welcome to all of you to this webinar in a series of similar events that we've been running for clients and stakeholders over the last few weeks. My name is Todd, and I head the Bowmans Dispute Resolution Department. And that is broadly a department in which our investigations activities are carried out. This is a panel discussion. And so I'm going to introduce our panels in a moment, but before I do that, you might have just seen a poll come up. One of the things that we like to do, and I'm just going to introduce you to that topic while we let a few more participants kind of trickle in. A poll, there are 3 poll questions. I hope you might find them reasonably easy to ask. You're not going to be marked on them. It's not a test. They will be completed anonymously. And the idea really is to just find out from our point of view what your perception is or perspective is on those topics. And we will compile the answers on an anonymous basis or the results from our participants and then share them if you would like to. And we do find that many of our participants are interested in how these sorts of questions are affecting their peers and across industries. So that was the poll questions that you saw come up. There's 2 ways of getting rid of them. Answer them preferably, and otherwise you can just minimize them. If I could then just introduce you to the rest of our panelists. Our topic, as you will know from the topic, is to talk about investigations and in particular how they've been affected during this extraordinary period across the globe when so many of us are working in so many different ways, what new problems are being thrown up during this period and how we are able to cope with them. So to help us talk through those questions, let me start with Terry Mwango, who is a very dynamic dispute resolution partner based in our Nairobi office. Terry, very active in the courts over these periods, in fact, grappling with a lot of the very problems that companies and clients are facing in the remote world environment. And Terry's also been very active in cross-border investigations, including right through this period, which is going to, I think, be precisely what we're talking about. Thank you very much, Terry. David Mpanga is, I don't think there's any doubt, one of the leading trial lawyers in Kampala, taking on lots of very tough mandates in the public and private sector and investigations in that jurisdiction and around. Matt Purchase, one of our partners based in Johannesburg, a very experienced partner too, conducted investigations across various jurisdictions and maybe for present purposes of importance, also experienced in West African jurisdictions. And then our special guest, who we're delighted to welcome as well, our colleague and friend, Aisling O'Shea, a partner in Sullivan Cromwell, based in Sullivan Cromwell's Washington, DC office. Aisling represents clients in all areas of white-collar criminal defense work and internal investigations, co-head of the firm's anti-corruption practice, and something that isn't common on this panel, former prosecutor, the US Department of Justice's Criminal Division in the FCPA unit, and something which also gives her some unique insights, which we're delighted to have you sharing with us, Aisling. I've introduced the panel before briefly running through some housekeeping matters, which maybe I should have done first. As participants, you are automatically muted and the chat functionality has been disabled. We would like you to talk to us through the Q&A function at the bottom of the panel. But we would love you to ask us questions if you've got them already. We've had a couple come in and are hoping it will engage with them anyway during the session. But if you've got questions, please do use the Q&A function. And then I will deal with them and put them to the appropriate panelist as and when I think is a good opportunity. And we're not going to provide written answers to them, but there will be a recording available of the webinar. So all of you who've participated can get a copy either emailed to you or from our website later on. So that's so much for introductions. Let me kick off by talking to the panelists. Maybe we can start. Terry, I introduced you first. Can you talk to us about any of the particular risks that have either been generated or created in this period, or perhaps been heightened or emphasized, that you've had to deal with in the investigations that you've been conducting recently? Terry.
Yes, thank you, Chris, for the introduction, and welcome everyone. We hope that you will enjoy a session which we hope will be interactive and engaging. So in Kenya, we have had two main issues come up as considerations that we think clients need to bear in mind in relation to the COVID-related risks. Now, first and foremost, I think corporate governance is something that I would believe is top of mind in a lot of our clients' organizations. So one of the things that we would recommend is that the audit work plans need to be relooked at. So ordinarily, every organization would of course have an audit work plan, but we now would advise that your audit work plans need to include the risks that the company is exposed to, particularly with working from home. So, working from home means that there's less oversight in terms of what staff members are doing or management is doing. So the audit plan would then need to, delve into what potential exposures a company is exposed to, and what are the procedures or processes that can be put into place to make sure that those are mitigated. And also the audit plan needs to look at people. Are your people safe? And if there are any employees who are coming into the company, say whether on a shift basis or once in a while, what processes have been put in place to ensure that your staff members are taken care of? So, for example, in Kenya, most organizations are providing masks, sanitizers, making sure that surfaces are wiped and cleaned regularly. So the audit plan is going to have to go over and above the usual checks and balances that companies have been looking at, and looking at what control measures are in place, not just from a financial perspective, but the loopholes also in terms of exposing people to the health risks associated. Another thing that companies need to look at is the board. The composition of the board, I think now more than ever, needs to be looked at from the perspective of, are the boards of organizations, do they have the right skills to be able to deal with the current pandemic and the challenges that companies have been exposed to? So, I think the skill set needs to be looked at. Boards need to start thinking about, do we have the right people? What's our response in terms of risk? Do we need to be looking at rejigging our boards and perhaps bringing in fresh talent, or relooking at how we're set up? And of course, strategy, that's very important. What strategy an organization had, say, come December 2019, has obviously got to be relooked at in terms of, what's the way forward. Of course, most businesses have been hit financially by the COVID-19 pandemic. So strategy needs to be looked at. And along the lines of the audit work plan, any exposures need to be closed. Heat map of risks is something that companies are going to need to look at. And the red ones that are flagged need more resources. So for example, are there any potential risks in relation to financial controls? For example, how are checks being signed? How are documents being signed? How are authorizations being signed? Later on, I'll talk about things like e-signatures, but the heat map needs to go to really drill down and look at the potential red risk areas and address how the company will respond to them. And of course, business continuity plans, that also goes back to strategy. How are you looking at continuity of the business? For example, if people in senior management or in the board fall sick, unfortunately, what's the business plan in terms of ensuring that there's continuity with relation to the financial exposure? if the business is suffering the financial effects of COVID, how are you looking at continuity? Are there potentially new areas of business that the business should be looking at? And other things related to governance, of course, is assets. With people working remotely, there's potentially more exposure to asset theft or misappropriation. So just making sure that there's controls around assets. Do we have security people deployed at our offices, or what are we doing about, say, if organizations have allocated laptops to employees, how are we making sure that laptops or assets that have been assigned to staff are accounted for? Organizations need to be making sure that assets are used for the purpose which they were given. So for example, are office laptops being used purely for office work, or are they being used for other things? Those kind of things need to be looked at. Cybersecurity is another big issue that is of concern, and I think this is not just unique to Kenya, but across, I think, the continent and the world, really. I mentioned about e-signatures. So a lot of us who are working remotely are signing documents electronically. So what does that mean? A document is sent to you and you append your signature electronically. But then those documents are being exchanged on email, and that means that, for example, there's an opportunity for somebody to then be able to plaque that e-signature and put it on other documents. So companies need to be thinking about security in terms of signature of documents. Is e-signature, is the e-signing of documents going to be the only way that companies want to sign documents, or should electronic signatures be the last resort? For example, should companies consider having riders or messengers take documents physically to directors for their signature, as opposed to having very sensitive signatures floating? Because if somebody is able to plaque a signature from a document, we all know that that poses a potential risk to the company in terms of documents being executed allegedly on behalf of the company, incorporation of fake companies, and such like. The other cybersecurity issue is VPNs. So most companies are using the VPN network to access their servers. But I think management and companies need to make sure that staff are only using VPNs, so that everything that is being exchanged on email is on a secure network. Of course, if that's not happening, then it means that organizations are exposed to hacking, stealing of documents, malware, and such like. There's obviously the challenge in conducting investigations generally. So for example, how are organizations conducting current investigations? Are the interviews happening virtually? If they're happening virtually, for example, is it video link, so that, for example, you're able to confirm that it's David Mpanga on the other side? Or are people having investigations where video link is not enabled, so that if somebody says, yes, this is Terry Mwango, there's no way of verifying that, so that you have an interview process which is challengeable at the end? So in companies perhaps wanting to conduct or continue to conduct investigations in relation to ongoing matters, I think a lot of thought needs to be given to how those investigations are conducted, if they're going to be done virtually. So that, of course, we know that with the public health restrictions on gathering of people, social distancing challenges as well, it's not practical to have one-on-one interviews in a number of cases. But I think a lot of thought needs to be given to, if there's going to be virtual interviews or telephone interviews, there need to be a lot of verification in terms of the person that you're interviewing is actually the person that they say to be. In terms of cybersecurity, there's also the challenge of organizations being unable to monitor employees' footprint. So for example, if there are websites that are not ordinarily allowed access to by employees or staff, are these now being accessed because, for example, staff are not using the VPNs or are bypassing that? So I think generally, just to sum up my comments on this, there's obviously opportunities that have arisen, unfortunately, with remote working in terms of fraud, in terms of misappropriation. So what this means for us as management and organizations, we need to be rethinking how we plan our strategy for the next few months, and we need to be looking at it. I think that the prudent thing to do is, even if you have like a work plan, an audit work plan, or a strategic map for the next few months, because the COVID situation keeps changing very dynamically, this is something that companies are going to have to be looking at every month, and just making sure that whatever plans had been put forward are still applicable. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much for that, Terry. That's quite a wide range of topics on governance and security, and including cyber security. Lots of food for thought. David, picking up on that, is this an easy period for fraudsters? Are there lots of government programs for fraudsters to take advantage of, or is it more difficult for fraudsters? Is it easier to find to expose them?
Thanks, Chris, and good afternoon, everyone. I think, Chris, it's been said that COVID has been a trend accelerator in many ways, accelerating existing trends or exposing existing weaknesses rather than bringing particularly new threats or new trends. I think that on the front of public sector corruption, where there have been high perceptions of corruption, for example, in Uganda ranks 137 out of 180 on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. There has been already evidence of the fact that corruption has simply shifted from where money was previously being spent to the new emergency monies being spent in relation to COVID. So when the emergency was refugees, we saw scandals in the refugee programs. When the emergency or the spending priority was infrastructure and roads, we saw an acceleration of misappropriation of money in the roads sector. When it was pensions, the same, and unfortunately with COVID, it's been no exception. Within about 10 days of the COVID lockdown being implemented, government had set up a program under the Office of the Prime Minister to feed the vulnerable poor who had to stay away from work and had fewer opportunities in relation to working from home. That meant distribution of food and other essential items, and these were being done out of the Office of the Prime Minister. On the 9th of April, that was done, the full lockdown was implemented on the 1st of April. On the 9th of April, the Permanent Secretary, who was the top civil servant in the Office of the Prime Minister, the Chief Accountant, the Assistant Procurement Commissioner, and the head of the COVID Relief Management Task Force, which must have been newly set up, maybe a month, were all arrested by the State House Anti-Corruption Unit in relation to alleged misappropriation of relief items. News reports indicated that some of the relief items, clearly marked as relief items for COVID relief, were found at schools belonging to these top officials. Because of course, this food can also be eaten by students who paid you school fees. The court case is still ongoing, but of course, I think it illustrates neatly the fact that wherever the spending priority is, if you're looking at public sector risk, you must understand that that's where, unfortunately, the corruption and fraud are going to migrate to. The same, interestingly, with our Parliament, when the executive presented an emergency budget for COVID relief and COVID emergency fighting funding, about $27 million was earmarked for the Ministry of Health in terms of capital expenditure and for emergency recurrent expenditure. About $2.7 million of that was appropriated by Parliament by an amendment to the Budget Committee's report, which was done at the very last minute, and that appropriation enabled the Parliamentary Commission to distribute an amount of about $5,500 to each MP's account, purportedly to fight COVID or to mobilize against COVID in their constituencies. Of course, if this is a public function and you expect that money's been put in people's private accounts, accountability for that would be rather difficult. On the back of an unhappy members of parliament, members of the budget committee and others, a matter was taken to court. An injunction was obtained directing that this money be put back in public control, either by being paid to the district accounting officers or being put back on the parliamentary commission's account to be sent back to the central fund. But again, I think another illustration straight out of all in April, showing that wherever there's a migration of COVID, of funds on government priorities, unfortunately, fraud and corruption moves. I think that also applies in the private sector as well. So whenever there's charitable fundraising to assist in the fight against COVID, wherever there's been a change in priorities, there often are opportunities which fraudsters will take quickly. We've also seen, though, the corollary on the private sector side, that the working from home has led to, as far as I'm aware, about 3 successful investigations occasioned by a reason of when people have had to migrate data onto electronic platforms to enable working from home. It's helped with easier analysis of data, which has shown anomalous spending patterns, which has led to investigations on one front. In another 2 occasions, it's the fact that people have been separated, teams have been created, an emergency essential working team set up, so certain duties had to be collapsed into single offices. That has meant that where people have been covering up for particular holes, those things have been taken over by 1, 2, or 3 people, some of whom are not members of this racket, and it has led to exposure. So there are opportunities for minimization of risk that have come up as a result of COVID. But I think there are also greater risks by reason of pooling of money to respond to the threat of COVID. And unfortunately, both in the private and public sector, we see the risk of people coming in to try and take advantage of that money and misappropriate it.
Thank you very much, David. COVID as an accelerator, that's a great phrase that I've learned, an acceleration both of opportunities for fraud, but also in some respects accelerating the exposure of some fraud. Aisling, I saw you nodding when David was talking about whenever there's an accumulation of spending in the private sector or a new line of spending, you can expect new lines of corruption. Is that something that seemed to resonate with you?
Yes, I can echo everything that David said with respect to fraud. In particular, in the US, we have seen rampant fraud associated with the various government-sponsored relief programs, both federal and state and local relief programs, and very rigorous, almost real-time enforcement of that fraud. So it's been a huge priority for enforcement here. And every day there are new charges that come out. Every day, all of our banking clients get alerted to new typologies of things out there. I think taking a step back from the US specifically and looking more globally and over both the immediate term horizon and a longer term horizon, I think David is right. Both all opportunities for government giving out funds and all major crises do lead to increased corruption risk. I think certainly we see here, given the scarcity of resources, given the already high risk for corruption in the healthcare sector, and that there is increased in many countries that haven't historically had very high amounts of public sector and private sector engagement. You are now seeing increased public-private interaction as both governments are trying to obtain for themselves access to healthcare, pharmaceuticals, PPE, serving as gatekeepers for those things, companies in the healthcare, PPE, pharmaceutical sector trying to get government contracts, trying to be part of studies. I think as we look going forward over the months and probably reverberations of the crisis for years to come, you are going to see a lot of corruption that specifically stemmed out of this pandemic. I note that in April, the OECD Working Group on Bribery announced that it was studying the risk of foreign bribery that was specifically associated with the coronavirus pandemic. So I think we're going to see a lot of that and increasing over time. So I completely agree with everything David said. And I think what we're seeing in the States as well as around the world is there's a series of relatively immediate actions that are stemming from the crisis. But as I said, I think the long-term reverberations are going to go for quite some time.
Thanks very much, Aisling. Matt, I'd like to bring you in here. Terry talked quite a bit about governance and security consequences and the kind of things that boards need to look at from a governance perspective. And she talked about programs, ongoing risk planning and business continuity plans. It must be a real challenge for organizations to decide how to allocate their resources during this period. Corporate risk resources, what do we expect of people, and how are companies managing that type of decision around allocation of resources?
Sure, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I must tell you, just before I answer your question, I did know, just to say, when David had mentioned how quickly there had been an enforcement response to sort of senior officials within the PM's department, I think that's heartening and quite encouraging. And certainly what Ashley was saying as well around the sort of rigorous enforcement of fraud on a daily basis is good. And it's, I suppose, a little bit different to what our position here in South Africa. And also just in talking about the allocation of resources and thinking about what Terry was saying as well, I think that when I think about it, there are three broad things. The one is that academically, fraud is said to occur where there's a rationalization, a motivation, and an opportunity. And really, if you think about COVID-19, two of those things, certainly the changed working circumstances, employees working from home, the changed control environment creates that opportunity. And I think that's a lot what Terry was talking about, where, for example, we don't have access to enterprise platforms, and approvals that are normally done on an enterprise platform are now being done by email or otherwise. So it creates that opportunity. And also, certainly from my perspective, I think that COVID-19 may also provide an increased incentive and motivation to a lot of people to engage in fraud. What we've seen is the contraction of a number of economies. Certainly the South African economy has contracted. Spouses and employees who are receiving reduced remuneration. So I suppose just as an overarching theme, I do think that's important to note, is that COVID-19 creates, I think, both an opportunity and an incentive for people, I think an increased incentive. So I think that's something just to think about. And then the other two broad things that I would want to emphasize is that, one, yes, there's an increased risk of the occurrence of fraud. And not to repeat what Terry was saying, but I think it's the access to enterprise platforms, the fact that there is an avoidance of, or there can be an avoidance of documented controls and procedures. And that's quite important. I think when you start talking about resources, what organizations can do, that's one of the important things. I think both for line managers and for compliance or audit functions within organizations, is to make sure that the controls and processes, to the extent that those need to be adjusted, that they are adjusted, and that employees are held to those controls and those measures. That would be one of the clear steps that can be taken. Terry mentioned the risk of phishing and cyber attacks, and that is more pronounced for the reasons she said. VPNs, or the fact that now approvals may be being sought through, for example, emails rather than on enterprise platforms. So I think that's important. The other thing is there needs to be some control over documents and data. With employees working remotely, that has a number of consequences. One of which is that certainly there's a breakdown in paper filing and document retention of paper records. But also, one has to give careful thought to the to data, the electronic data as well. Employees working remotely implies that in many instances that sensitive data is not being backed up regularly onto enterprise servers, and also that employees are in control of a lot of that data. They're in control of physical documents, and they're in control of electronic data that is now being stored and retained by them, locally, whether they're working from home or wherever. And that has consequences. One is the loss of data. The other is the theft of data. So controls around encryption of data, particularly depending on your function, but the loss of data from employees working out of the office is a material risk and can certainly contribute to fraud, to fraud and theft. And then I'd had a short, interesting conversation with David, and David, I think, actually mentioned that the working circumstances around COVID have meant that sort of cabals or rackets of employees who are acting in concert to commit frauds have been broken up, and has led to the discovery of fraud. But equally, I think that if one has regard to the number of frauds which are investigated as a result of whistleblowing or employee interaction, the fact that there is so much less of that at the moment may also have an impact on the ability to uncover those frauds. So I think for all of those reasons, and I've moved through them quite quickly, but I think on a concrete basis, for those reasons, I think that there's certainly an increased risk of the occurrence of fraud. But the other part, which I think is very interesting and frankly something that's very challenging for us, as advisors to multinational clients, is the difficulties around investigating fraud during COVID. And Terry mentioned again sort of the difficulties of establishing who you're speaking to in, whether it's in teleconference or video conferences. But it goes much further than that. In my experience, conducting interviews with people is very difficult. So, I mean, there are a few things. One is it's very easy under COVID conditions for people to avoid interaction with company representatives or investigators. So, Chris, if you were looking for me and wanted to discuss something with me, under these COVID conditions, it's fairly easy for me to refuse to meet with you in person out of COVID concerns, and to generally be unavailable. And even more so, it's more pronounced with investigators. And where you're conducting interviews, for example, using a video conference, which is far from optimal, and it's happened to me in practice, is if you ask an employee a difficult question, the line just gets dropped, and if you're lucky, you can see him, ripping the network cable out the back of the computer. But all that happens is he'll end the interview, and then 2 hours later, when you call him up, he's rehearsed his answer to that difficult question you were asking him. So I think there's a real difficulty there about conducting investigations. And the other thing, and I'll also put it together here, but the other thing to think about is that employees now, in many cases, depending on the nature of the information, are uniquely sitting with that information at home. So again, if you're conducting an investigation, it's fairly easy for me to go into your office, for me to access your computer and to access the company documents and information. When you're sitting at home, I have no ability to access those documents, and particularly documents that are relevant to an investigation. So I think those are some of the issues around that. Perhaps that's a good point for me to pause.
Thanks very much, Matt. That's much appreciated. We've been talking a lot about the problems that COVID has accelerated, or the solutions that it's accelerated. Aisling, can we move over and get a view from Washington? what are US enforcement authorities, moving from the company perspective out of what's going wrong and what kind of fraud is or isn't difficult to detect? What are the enforcement authorities doing? It's always something which we're very alive to across our jurisdictions, is that the activity levels and the activities of US enforcement authorities reverberate across many jurisdictions where US headquartered companies do business. So what is going on? Have they gone to sleep? Are they waiting for the next presidential election? Or can you tell us a bit about that environment?
No comment as to who's awaiting the next presidential election. They have not gone to sleep. I think, picking up on what Matt just said, the US authorities are, I think, doing their best under the circumstances and are trying to be understanding of the fact that companies facing the same problems are doing their best. So just they're facing all of the same issues that Matt just articulated about trying to continue investigations, conduct witness interviews, and repeatedly in both public and private statements, what they have tried to say to companies conducting internal investigations is that they understand, of course, the safety and logistical challenges that have been posed by the pandemic. Again, I think that that's not uniformly true. We are seeing some negotiation over doing formal interviews, and on the part of the regulators, not the criminal authorities in the states, sometimes formal testimony by video conference, which poses its own challenges. Our courts have now been cleared to conduct a number of criminal proceedings that previously needed to be in person by video conference and by telephone. So that has posed its own challenges. So I would say our enforcement authorities, both the DOJ and regulatory enforcement authorities, are themselves experiencing all the same challenges that Matt articulated on the part of companies, and are generally trying to be understanding, but have taken the opportunity to make it clear over and over that from a substantive perspective, there is not going to be any lowering of expectations in this period. So from a practical perspective, if you can't produce documents to them because you can't access an office or a server, and if an interview needs to be put off, they're all very understanding about that. But they've made it clear again and again when it comes to issues of, as Terry said, governance, when it comes to issues of, appropriately investigating internal risk, as David and Matt have said, when it comes to whether companies are going to be given self-disclosure credit for uncovering things in a timely manner, those expectations have not changed. They continue working. They're subject to the same challenges the rest of us are, but are moving forward. There were just last week 2 FCPA resolutions by both DOJ and SEC, so they were continuing to bring cases. And I think some people who have had relatively inactive cases as prosecutors and authorities have been, traveling around the globe on planes, following up on other investigations. Some investigations that have been dormant have heated back up because they may present work that the government enforcers can do while they're in quarantine as well. I think we've also seen some attention to the policy side on behalf of the US government while everyone is in quarantine. The DOJ released an updated version of its corporate compliance program guidance, and I think the changes in that were relatively minimal, but really reflected an emphasis, which has been a continued emphasis on the part of the DOJ in companies adopting lessons learned in developing and improving their compliance programs. Interestingly, I thought was the notion that companies should be, in the updated guidance, that companies should be taking in both lessons learned as a result of previous incidents at their own companies, but also the lessons learned of companies in their industry and operating in their geographies, which I think is an important message for companies operating on the continent, that if you come through and see an enforcement action from the United States related to risks that could be considered regional risks throughout, for example, West Africa, there is an expectation that you're going to incorporate that into your own risk assessment and figure out what you can learn both from what's happened in your company in the past, but also from both your industry and regional peers. So in summary, we've been seeing quite a lot of activity with obviously the inherent limitations of everyone being stuck in one place.
Aisling, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. Terry, in Nairobi, the enforcement activities have, and I asked it rather rudely to Aisling, I apologize, Aisling, to say have they gone to sleep, Terry, just in your experience, have you found that Kenyan enforcement authorities, have they been very active? Have they not been? What sort of examples are occurring?
Thank you, Chris. So we've had a few challenges. Like Aisling has mentioned, we've also had logistical issues, mainly factored by the fact that Nairobi and Mombasa, which are two major counties in Kenya, have been on lockdown. So for example, in one investigation that I've been doing for almost 2 years now, at the point where we thought we had gotten, we had made headway with the police, they've now said that because of COVID, they're not, they've pretty much down their tools. So that feedback has been given in a number of investigations that we're doing, where the police have seemed hesitant to move along and have used COVID as an excuse. From a court perspective, a few days ago we had a decision that was handed down in respect of an anti-corruption matter in Kenya. I think it was a landmark decision. In Kenya, the government has been under pressure for years now, to be seen to be doing something about corruption in the public sector. Now, that is a matter that proceeded to conclusion. However, most of our courts are not actually going to full hearing. So whereas we have virtual attendances for mentions and applications, most courts are not actually going to viva voce hearings. So what that has meant for our clients, especially those who have criminal ongoing matters against, for example, former employees or employees that have been charged in criminal matters, then those matters cannot move forward. The reality is that we are now in the second part of the year, and it seems very unlikely that in terms of litigation in Kenya, any decisions are going to be handed down anytime soon, or any hearings are going to start commencing anytime soon. So just to quickly wrap up, from an enforcement perspective, we're certainly facing the same challenges that Aisling has mentioned in respect of the US, and we see that those challenges are going to continue. So, this goes back to then the governance issues. I think we now we need to start thinking about how do we close some of these loopholes that have been created by COVID, so that we can mitigate against having to then put ourselves in the enforcement area or in litigation, which is now at a go-slow in Kenya.
Thank you, Terry. David, just coming back to you, we've heard really, it might be just a common theme that across multiple jurisdictions that only companies are challenged in conducting investigations during this period, but authorities too. Has that been your experience?
Yes, it has, Chris, and the government has had to prioritize certain areas. I think Matthew picked up on the fact that the Office of the Prime Minister investigation was done very quickly. That's a special unit under State House, under the President of the Office of the President, and it tends to be able to kind of move rather fast because it's well facilitated and has capacity to do things that are on high on His Excellency's radar. I think the regular enforcement organs have suffered just like those in Kenya and in other places. The Inspectorate of Government, I think, was working from home. That's the first time that they'd ever done it. The information that I have is they didn't have much by way of a platform to start from. So for the first few weeks of remote working, in inverted commas, they were simply at home because the whole department had been designed and was generally working in one place. And when they had to shelter, away from the office, away from the workplace. They were paralyzed. Zoom and all these other things that private sector organizations take for granted were fairly new and hard to implement because, again, they weren't laptop, take home, etc., etc. The same with the police, because on many occasions, investigations, even private investigations, going hand in hand with the police. The police had to put a lot of their emphasis on the enforcement of lockdown and response to lockdown-related crimes. That tended to mean that if you went over with, we've got indications of fraud at this level, you had to see, regularly the fraud squad people, but the fraud squad people were either sheltering or had been put on lockdown prevention, lockdown-related crime prevention duty. So regular white-collar crime and the like were kind of put on the back burner, and the resources for that were limited. I think lastly, there's also the fact that courts were closed down in order to protect the public and the members of the judiciary, and we're only working on a minimum emergency basis. So you needed for the first part of our lockdown certificates of emergency. We still need certificates of emergency to proceed, but at least lawyers can attend courts. Initially, there was no certificates of emergency issued to lawyers. So courts were running and only dealing with emergency issues like remands and bail applications or habeas corpus applications. If you're looking for a warrant, search warrant, if you're looking for a dawn raid order from a civil court, you have to establish that it's an emergency. Thankfully, lawyers are now able to travel. Initially, there was permission given to only 30 lawyers across the country. And imagining that was to be determined by the Uganda Law Society, a society of lawyers, there was never agreement on which 30 will travel. So until all the lawyers were let out, no lawyers were moving freely. We had to get onto bikes and things to get to court. So I think generally the challenges of lockdown, the challenges of COVID that are faced across the globe are replicated in Uganda as well.
Thanks very much, David. Matt, I said I would come back to you on enforcement, and you had some remarks you wanted to make on that particularly. I don't know if that flows from what Aisling said or either of David or Terry.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I must tell you, I can't resist telling a personal anecdote when I hear about the virtual court proceedings. In South Africa, we address judges sitting in court as my lord. And my wife is an expert witness. She's a psychologist and an expert witness, and has had to appear virtually from home in virtual court proceedings on an unstable connection. And I think all of our neighbors are a bit concerned because they hear her saying at the top of her voice, "Can you hear me, my lord?" So anyway, but apart from that, I think from an enforcement point of view, I think that certainly there are similarities. I think that this COVID lockdown does coincide, I think, with quite an interesting period in South Africa around enforcement. We've moved over the recent past from a distinct lack of corruption enforcement under our previous president to a renewed focus on corruption enforcement, and also institutional stability within our prosecutorial and enforcement agencies, the NPA and the police. In the past, frankly, the past decade, there's been a great deal of institutional instability with senior people leaving those organizations to a position now where we've seen the creation of new specialized enforcement agencies that seem to be well resourced and seem to have appropriately qualified and experienced people. And I think, for example, of the Investigations Directorate, the newly established Investigations Directorate, established under Harry and Cronje at the National Prosecuting Authority. So those, So it's an interesting period in South Africa for enforcement, because certainly the hope, and I think there's some legitimate expectation that we will see more robust domestic enforcement against corruption, particularly in the context of state capture related matters. That's certainly the message that is being put out by the president and by senior politicians and by enforcement agencies, police, the Hawks, the prosecuting authority that we deal with on a fairly regular basis. That is certainly the message that's being put out there. And I think there's a legitimate expectation that we'll see, and we hope to see more of that.
Matt, there's maybe an expectation and a hope, as what you're saying. I'm sure I read articles suggesting both that although they filled their current vacancies and aren't expecting a reduction in funding in the NPA, they could do with 2 or 3 times the number of people that they've got. And I also couldn't help noticing the Deputy Chief Justice running the Commission into State Capture, bemoaning the fact that there had been so few prosecutions or investigations arising out of corruption at, for example, PRASA, one of our major state-owned entities.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of, and you know, Ashley may, in fact, Ashley, I think with her, particularly with her own direct experience, could probably comment on this. But in South Africa, we don't have a strong system of individuals moving between the public and private sector. So the prosecution, you know, in many other jurisdictions, and I can't speak with any authority, but I understand in the US, it is often the case that people employed by the state within prosecutorial roles will move to the private sector, and even vice versa. Whereas that's not the case here. So there is a capacity issue, Chris, around that, and a funding issue, no doubt. And if I could just comment on the expectation, that is one of the issues. And I think COVID's had a material impact there. If you look at the State Capture Commission, you know, it started with a real, you know, it started as a bit of a wildfire, and it was televised every day, and there was a great level of public interest in it. And that has waned over time. And the commission has already requested a postponement. And with COVID now, certainly my personal expectation is that they will in due course apply for a further postponement, which means that commission is now becoming drawn out, and that public expectation that's been created around prosecution, I think there's a bit of an exhaustion creeping in, that there hasn't been, that the commission hasn't yet been finalized, and that there haven't been prosecutions. And I don't think there's a clear understanding amongst the layperson that the commission doesn't have a criminal function. It doesn't result of itself. It doesn't result in the prosecution of individuals, and that the separate police investigation and prosecution is a separate process that still needs to run.
Can I just thank you very much, Matt. State resources is a huge question in enforcement in this country. What resources are given to the state and how they can activate them? Actually, if I could just ask you, at times I've heard fears expressed that the current presidency might lead to the hollowing out of some of the enforcement agencies in the US. And I don't know if that's a real fear or it's been any sort of hard examples of it, but I'd be interested to hear from you what you think about that and how that might affect the enforcement environment going forward. And then similar comments, David and Terry, before we close, to see what the future prognosis is looking like on enforcement in your jurisdictions.
Sure. So I think certainly that is a concern that was expressed particularly with respect to FCPA and anti-corruption enforcement because of some comments that had been made by the president before he was the president related to the FCPA. I think what we have seen over the course of the past 4 years is that, you know, really perhaps the best measure of prioritization are the resources given to something in the US DOJ and the SEC, which are the two agencies in the US who have been charged with FCPA enforcement. the size of their FCPA units, that is the dedicated prosecutors at the DOJ and regulatory attorneys at the SEC who focus exclusively or primarily on FCPA issues, has only grown. So, and I left early in the current administration, so haven't worked there in a few years, but in terms of the size of the units and the number of individuals who are dedicated to those issues, those units have grown. I think within the law enforcement agencies, David made the point when talking about the current crisis that law enforcement resources too, in the US, federal law enforcement agent resources are necessarily finite and do shift according to whatever the enforcement priorities of the day are. And I think that is a little bit more opaque because from agency to agency, a couple of our federal law enforcement agencies had dedicated squads, probably none as famous as the Hawks, focused on anti-corruption issues, but the boundaries tended to be looser, and there are a lot of federal law enforcement agencies who work on corruption and other white-collar matters, but also other kinds of crime. And certainly what we're seeing now is a tremendous dedication of resources at the federal level as well as the state level related to fraud arising from the stimulus programs. Whether those resources come at the expense of other investigative priorities, I'm sure they do, but I think we're going to need some time out to look backwards on, the people who are focused on unemployment fraud now, or paycheck protection program fraud now. What would they have been doing in 2020 had they not had to do these? I'm sure we will have to see some kind of drop in other cases because resources are finite, but we can't see that yet.
Thanks so much, Aisling. David, do the authorities talk a good game and then starve the enforcement authorities of resources, or are we looking to efficient, well-staffed and growing activities of enforcement authorities?
Mixture of both, Chris. There's certainly been a lot of talk around anti-corruption. It tends to go up close to elections, and we have an election coming up in 2021. And there's been very tough talk on corruption as a result of COVID and as a result of the shrinkage of the economy as a result of COVID. Election time also brings into sharp relief issues relating to service delivery, which again mean that anti-corruption becomes a very important part of campaign discussion. We've found over the years that many times, not only is there not the capacity to fight so much the will, but the lack of capacity to deal with the extent of the problem. And on many occasions, even the anti-corruption effort is hampered by corruption at investigation level, at judicial level, and in other respects. I think this time round, we're seeing a lot of determination focused on increasing the revenue base. So there's lots of tax loopholes being closed. The top of the Uganda Revenue Authority was recently overhauled, we understand, due to allegations of corruption. I think that there will be probably a bit more determination in getting bigger fish, as they're called, caught in the nets rather than the usual small fry. And one expects that the courts, we have a dedicated anti-corruption court, that the courts will have a lot of work related to and arising out of COVID relief funds and the things that have happened as a result of COVID.
Thank you for that fishing analogy from the shores of the Great Lake, David. That's a very appropriate one in many ways. We're about to close, and for those, thanks very much. Most of you have completed the poll. So here are the poll results. Terry, while we look at those, I was going to give you the closing remarks on the same question about enforcement authorities, but let's, you can see these here, and we will also send them to you. So what it means is we're about evenly split on the question whether the changed working circumstances has adversely impact the control environment. for some people feeling it, for about half people saying it does, and similarly the other half not. Updated procedures. This is very interesting because this is the progressive part of COVID, the COVID crisis, where organizations have largely implemented updated procedures and controls in the light of the remote working environment. So that's probably a positive evolution of that point. And then lastly, as the lockdown adversely affected ability to monitor, investigate, and we were heard earlier from David and Matt, two sides of that coin. Lockdown making fraud more easily permissible and more difficult to pick up, and in some cases, remote working making it easier to pick up fraud. And actually, most people think that lockdown hasn't adversely affected the organization's ability to monitor, investigate, and address fraud and misconduct. So thanks very much for giving us that. That kind of information is always useful for us to engage with our clients. Thank you for completing the poll and for participating. Terry, I did promise to come back to you in case you had any words you wanted to add to David's and Ashling's, which started with Matt actually, about the physical resources available and the budget and infrastructure available to tackle corruption. And I think I asked David, are the Kenyan authorities talking a good game, or are they actually growing and expanding and building their arsenal?
Thank you, Chris. I think from the perspective of the judiciary, there's certainly, with the recent decision in the National Cereals and Produce Board decision a couple of days ago or a week ago, there's certainly now, in the public eye at least, an impression has been created that there is an appetite for bringing to book people who are perceived to have, engaged in corruption. Whether or not that is going to be a sustained exercise is yet to be seen. In relation to COVID-related funds and that misappropriation, I think it's still early days, but certainly I do expect that, in the next year or so, we're going to start to hear and see, about instances where persons are being accused of having, misappropriated funds. I think my parting shot would be, to our clients who are still on, that there's certainly a lot of work to be done in terms of making sure that we tie up the loose ends and make sure that, internally we have processes and systems and control, not only to be able to monitor, but to be able to make sure that, we're not exposing ourselves to misappropriation, fraud, and such like.
Thank you very much indeed, Terry. And I found this discussion really interesting, really engaging. Possibly one of the most interesting things is about the common themes that we're experiencing, the challenges both during this period and the reactions of our enforcement authorities are so common. Part of that encourages me because when you run a dispute resolution practice in a law firm that operates across as many jurisdictions as we do, that is comforting, rather, because the challenge is grappling with so many different regimes. So thank you very, very much, Aisling, David, Matt, and Terry, and to our participants. We really enjoyed having you along, and we hope that we will be able to host you for another conversation before too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.